everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm Rebecca Hauer. I'm the Knowledge Exchange Manager here at YouthREX, and I'm very happy to have a conversation today about how we can support positive outcomes for youth involved with the law in Ontario. So today what we're going to be talking about is a research report that we're going to be releasing later today. We have the lead author here to share, as well as other co-authors to share their perspectives. So we're going to start out with a research summary. We're going to ground our comments in a case study, which I have sent to anyone who registered before Monday. So if you registered after Monday, you can get that in the handout section. And then we're going to wrap up with the key findings from the research and some recommendations, and we'll have some time for questions. So before we get started, we'd really like to know how you come to this work. We're going to ask you how you're involved with supporting youth involved with the criminal justice system. So if you could just take a second to respond. We'd like to know if you actually work in the criminal justice system currently, if you work with youth in the school system, if you work with youth in the child welfare system, if you work with youth in community-based diversion programs, or if you work with youth in community-based programs that potentially do prevention, but not formally diversion. Thanks for filling it out. A lot of people work in community-based programs that are not diversion. Oh, it looks like there's a mistake in the poll. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so what we're seeing now, which is I think I'll wait for 5 more seconds, and we'll close it now. So we're seeing that 78% voted. Okay, I'm going to ask to get 85. Can the people who haven't voted just weigh in? Great, it's going up. It's a voluntary vote, though. No pressure. Okay, we'll close the poll. That's good. We definitely have a significant sample. We have a lot of people working with youth in the criminal justice system, and we have a lot of people working in community-based programs. Now, there was a mistake in the poll, so I wonder how many of you work with community-based programs that are diversion. Perhaps in the question period, you can identify what context you're coming from. The reason why we're asking this is useful for the presenters, but it's also interesting to think of all of us as supporting youth who may not be involved with the law, who have potential to be involved with the law, but how we're all working together ideally in a more integrated way. So people are working in the school system, you interface with the criminal justice system. People in child welfare, definitely. People in the criminal justice system, it'd be great if you're interfacing with the community programs and vice versa. So thanks everyone for filling that out. So a couple of things to keep in mind as we go forward. This webinar is going to be recorded, so you'll be able to check it out again later. It'll be on our website. If you have any trouble with the audio quality, often that's due to an internet connectivity issue. There was a phone number included in the email that we sent, so you could call in, and that usually clears up any problems. Questions. So part of the GoToWebinar, you have a control panel and there's a question section. That's where you can type in your questions. For today, for people who registered before Monday, we did send out a request for questions in advance, and we did get some questions in advance. So we will be replying to select questions there, but then we're also opening it up to all of you at the end. We are committing to respond to each of your questions and posting them on our website in our webinar recap afterwards. So if we don't get to your question today, because there are a lot of people on the webinar, you can look for an answer to your question on our website, or you can email us directly. You can also tweet us today, tweet out your experiences on Twitter tag us at Rex for Youth, and we can have a conversation there as well. So about YouthREX, if you're new to YouthREX, if you haven't heard about YouthREX, we're 2 years old. We're funded by the Ministry of Children and Youth Services, and our mission and our work is to make research, evidence, and evaluation practices accessible and relevant to Ontario's grassroots youth sector. And We work provincially. We have a regional hub model, and so we have offices across the province. So you can check out this map and see if there is an office that's closest to you, and then you can connect directly with that office, and they should be able to teach you or introduce you more to YouthREX and figure out how we can learn together to support youth. Our 3 service streams are knowledge mobilization, customized evaluation supports, and capacity building. This is part of our knowledge mobilization stream. Our webinars, we do a monthly webinar on issues related to youth work and youth well-being and evaluation. We also host an online resource hub called theexchange.youthrex.com, which has almost 1,000 resources related to youth work, as well as an evaluation toolkit, an evaluation measures inventory, and a whole range of resources to support youth work. We have a weekly blog where I invite any of you who are interested in sharing your experiences in youth work on our blog to let us know. And if you have any resources that you'd like to have shared on the exchange, please send an email. Customized evaluation supports, that's the direct support we give to eligible grassroots youth organizations to support them to understand the impact of their program. You can read more about it on our website. And then capacity building, we run a couple of courses and workshops. We're currently running a free online course for program evaluation for youth well-being, so it's specific to a youth sector context, how you do program evaluation in that context. We also run a face-to-face course on critical youth work, as well as workshops that are run through the hubs on an ongoing basis. If you're interested in having us do a workshop in your area, please contact us, let us know, and we're happy to discuss, see how we can make that happen. So today, I'm happy to present our guest presenters. Our lead author on this report is Dr. Siu-Ming Kwok. He's a professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the Southern Alberta region of the University of Calgary. He has extensive research experience in the areas of social justice among youth and youth in conflict with the law. In Canada, in 2014, he testified to the Senate Standing Committee on Human Rights about youth involvement with the law. So he is drawing on a very extensive background in the field. Heidi HeavyShield has an MSW and an RSW. She's an instructor also in the Faculty of Social Work, Southern Alberta region for the University of Calgary. Heidi works in the criminal justice system in Alberta and has a specialty in working with Indigenous people, families, communities, and her practice interests include intergenerational trauma, the legacy of residential schools, and loss and grief. So she'll be drawing on that experience to share with us as well. And then Rebecca Weatherstone is a social worker who works in the correctional sector for the Ontario Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services. She has her MSW from King's University College. She has her MSW from Wilfrid Laurier and her undergraduate from King's University College. She has a range of experience. She's very interested in mental health. And I should mention that Siu-Ming was the academic director of our Southwest Hub in London for 2 years for getting YouthREX off the ground in the Southwest region. In London, Siu-Ming got a new appointment in Professor Siu-Ming moved to an appointment in Alberta, so we miss him very much, but we're happy to stay. We're really lucky and happy to stay in touch with him. So he has a lot of practice experience here in the Ontario context as well. And at this point, I'd love to pass it over to our featured presenters.
Before the presentation, I'd like to say thank you to all of you and all of you who come to this webinar. One thing I want to share with you is I'm not going to teach you anything. Instead, I want to share with you our experience and our research, all right, and also about the current literature, so that I want to change the whole thing, the whole webinar as a platform, so that as a dialogue, we can share and discuss about how we can support the youth involved with the law in Canada. I provide just a brief context about our presentation first. and especially about youth involved with the law. There are two main points in this slide I want to highlight. The first is about the number of youth involved in the law system in Canada are actually decreasing over the past 2 decades, and I will explain to you in a minute. The second point I'd like to emphasize with you is about the change of the legislation landscape in Canada. It changed from a focus on custody to non-custody approach right over the past century, actually. Because at the first beginning, in 1908, we used like a Juvenile Delinquency Act, which is a child welfare approach, actually. We put children in custody, okay, under the name of welfare. And the consequence is we put someone in custody longer than they deserve, actually. And then we moved to a 1984 to Young Offender Act, which is quite heavily reliant on court system. And the consequence is Canada become one of the highest incarceration rate for the youth. We put more youth in prison and jail than we expected. So that then in 2003, we find something wrong, and then we change the legislation, and now we have two-tier system. The two-tier system, that means for the first time and then non-violence, we call it a youth, and then we will try our best to divert them out of the system. We use different kind of diversion program, and then try to keep them out of the system. And for those a repeated offender, we call it, or like serious offense, then we try to put them in custody. So that is a two-kind system. But our intention is try our best in Canada in the system to keep those youth when they are like minor offense, first time, and we try to put them out of the system, which is a good concept actually. But there's some unintended consequences, and then we will explain to you also in a minute. Now we move to the next slide. You can see from the chart that since 1991, the number of youth involved in the law is decreasing. And then you can see this is a pattern. We can see that it's decreasing. The line here, 2003, is the line for the new legislation was in effect, which is the Youth Criminal Justice Act. I mentioned it to you before about the two-tier system. We use the diversion program more. Not only the number, and also about the series of crime actually also decreasing in here. So that the line pattern is also dropping in here. And that is just information for you. The most common offense committed by the youth. All right, here, the most top one here is the theft, about 11%. All right, go to the new legislation about the Youth Criminal Justice Act. So you can see here, this line, the light blue line is the youth being charged by the police. And this line for the dark blue is the youth not charged by the police. You can see that now because of the new legislation, the trend changed. Now we are going to divert more youth when they in contact with the law. We try to divert them outside the system. So you can see the trend here. So that means the legislation, it seems to us, is working because we will now use more non-custody measure to try to ask them stay in the community or not even have any contact with the court, which is quite good actually because many theory already indicated that if you've got more involved in the system, that may not be helpful for them. However, there are some consequences or unintended consequences as a result of the law, the new legislation. The first one is about the impact, unintended impact on Indigenous youth and also on the youth from the racialized group. There's some number in here. You can see that on the slide. So 33% of admission to custody in 2014 and 15 in that year is from Indigenous youth. However, Indigenous youth only consists 7% of the youth population in that jurisdictions. That means it's overrepresented. And we also know that we don't have that kind of statistic because this is one of the limitations in our research, in the Canada research, I mean. We don't have race-based data on youth caught. In other words, other than Indigenous youth, we don't know about the exact number of like visible minority youth from racialized group, how many of them are actually in the custody. We don't know. However, we see that from our practice, and also when we interview people, we see that the increasing number of like youth from racialized groups being put in custody over the past decade. So this is, before we go to the case study, this is another model we want to share with you because of our over the past 15 years, we are studying about Asian youth in conflict with the law. And there's a 4 major structural factor, or we call it context, which impact on the youth, how they will go to the criminal pathway, we say that. The first one is about their hope in the society, or attachment in the society, because they feel that they don't have the hope or alienate from the society, the first element. And also about why they feel that. There's a variety of reasons. One of them for the youth from racialized group is about discriminations, some of them, so that they feel highly being discriminated in the system. Interesting thing is we have finding indicate that the second generation actually have more resentful to the system than the first generations, because they feel that they don't have, like when they speak English, they don't have accent. They were born in Canada, they have nowhere to go. They are Canadian citizens. However, they are still receiving that kind of discriminations from the system. So they're so disappointed, and they say that. And then the second one is cultural value, so that it's related to about self-identity. So do you have a solid self-identity when you grow up? And the next element is about how in-depth the youth involved into the criminal system. And the last one is about support system, which means informal as well as formal system. And then you can see here from different stages, stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. And from each stages, then we can see that their family relationship, their linkage to the criminal pathway, and how they're going to get help is different from each stage. In other words, each stage will have to have different kind of treatment or different kind of intervention or helping plan set up for them actually. So there's no one cookie cutter approach for all of the stages. And what I also want to emphasize about that, when we say about a diversion program, and then we always focus on stage one about the redefining self before they actually get into the system. And we can talk to it and we can explain to it more when you ask us more questions. And then we go to the case study.
Good morning. Heidi HeavyShield here. I'm going to introduce a case study, but first I'd like to recognize a couple of things. I want to thank YouthREX, but I also want to recognize the Indigenous people on the traditional territories that we're presenting today here in Southern Alberta, the Blackfoot in the Treaty 7 territory, and also recognize the Indigenous people upon the land that you gather in Ontario today. So a way of kind of sharing some of the research and a way to really invite you and engage you in a conversation, as was introduced here earlier, to get you to think about your involvement and how your own work in the community or child welfare or correctional system, early intervention, how your involvement could really offer some suggestions or recommendations on how to work with youth in conflict with the law. So we're going to introduce a case study and really invite you to think about some of the responses, and we'll also share from our own practice perspective some of the evidence-based and also best responses for working with these youth. So let's meet Shane. Shane is 16 years old. He has an Indigenous background, and he's been referred to the extrajudicial measures program, which is a diversion program. and referred by police. So the reason for the referral, Shane was accused of theft and was referred by police to an extrajudicial measure program. Shane went with another, and just a little background about what happened. Shane went with another young adult to a larger electronic retail store. A staff of the store witnessed the young adult had a conversation with Shane in front of the cell phone accessories aisle, and then the young adult headed out the store himself. After the young adult left shortly, Shane started putting some cell phone accessories in his backpack and left the store. Shane was stopped at the exit of the store. Unpaid item of cell phone accessories with an amount of $500 was found from Shane's backpack. Both Shane's mother and police were called. So you can kind of see as we're introducing this context for referral that this could be something that we could, all of us relate to in how we encounter some of the youth. This could be a very common scenario. After talking to Shane and his mother and understanding more about his family background in the police station, the police decided not to press charges against Shane for his actions and offer him an opportunity to participate in the extrajudicial measure program, as Siu-Ming had mentioned, to really divert youth from encountering the court system and keeping them out of custody. And Shane agreed to voluntarily participate in this program. So some of the intake information before charging Shane, what they've learned is that Shane lives with his mother in social housing and the family is on social assistance. A little background about his own history. When Shane was 8 and his sister was 2, his family moved from their First Nation community to the city nearby in southwestern Ontario. So just to create some context there for you. His father left the family when he was 10 and his mother suffered from depression. His younger sister was in care of Children's Services at the age of 4 under a voluntary agreement with the Ministry of Children and Youth. Fortunately, his sister died in care at age 6 months due to an unfortunate car accident. Shane has a history of self-harming behavior, and his father left the family and is grieving the loss of both his father and his sister. So we're seeing that there's issues around loss, issues around disconnection from his family, his community. He was struggling in school. Those of you that mentioned you work in the school system, we understand that he was struggling in school and claimed to be affiliated with an Indigenous urban gang as a fringe member, which is really quite common with a lot of the youth being involved in gangs and that lifestyle. The young adult who went with Shane to the electronics store is his big brother, surrogate big brother in the gang. So I'd like to pass this over to Rebecca, our colleague, for her practice perspective on the case study.
Thank you, Heidi. Welcome everyone for coming in. I'm going to talk a little bit about the case and kind of pepper it into some different ideas. So it sounds like everybody here has a lot of experience and a broad kind of wealth of knowledge. So every youth we work with has many different complex areas in their life. These areas are often woven together and impact feelings and behaviors of the youth. So looking at the case example Heidi presented, the loss of Shane's father and sister, his mother's socioeconomic status and home neighborhood, as well as other experiences may have played a significant role in Shane's desire to become a part of another family in the form of the gang. By learning about each area of a youth's life, a more thorough understanding of their experience can address the underlying feelings that result in the criminal behaviors. So using systems theory, we understand that each system must be integrated and involved to ensure the social detriments of health are being addressed. So using a proper assessment system to ensure that we are looking at each area and each system of a youth's life. So this means the school system, the family unit or units, community partners, and all other systems involved with youth must learn about their class status, social supports, including friend groups, education level and capacity for education, their physical environment, what does their home look like, personal health, coping skills, gender, and cultural background. Next slide, please, Heidi. So for example, in our case study, Shane will be reintegrating back into the school system. With the school and his teachers on board, Shane can not only increase his education level, but also be supported to create a new social network and establish perhaps new pro-social friendships outside of the gang. The family unit can also be supported through the EJM program to assist in finding new coping strategies to minimize Shane's self-harming behavior and any other mental health concerns. With each system working together to support Shane, each social determinant of health can be elevated in a way where his overall well-being is maximized. Next slide, please, Heidi. So, as Rebecca mentioned, my background is predominantly in mental health. And there's a little bit of kind of systems going on in the ministry. Justice workers, as well as research, has identified a large number of youth involved in the criminal justice system as having significant mental health concerns and/or difficulties with emotional regulation. So for many of these youth, such mental health concerns can play a significant role in the crime itself. In Ontario, youth justice courts are realizing that these causes of crime must be addressed in order to reduce additional involvement with the criminal justice system. So providing youth with effective supports to assess, treat, and maintain mental health not only reduces criminal justice involvement, but also increases community safety. Implementing mental health supports for youth experiencing pro-criminal emotions and/or behaviors really addresses why the crime took place instead of punishing the youth for their struggles going on. Significant research has shown mental health struggles are highly correlated with substance abuse, and as such, addiction programming has also been more readily available for youth involved in the criminal system. Some of the more sophisticated court systems even have treatment programs for concurrent disorders, recognizing that addictions are a form of coping with mental health difficulties, and that both need to be addressed to really reduce recidivism. This is actually a big shift for courts to recognize concurrent disorders. So looking through a mental health lens, these youth within the criminal justice system are struggling in their daily lives to cope with many different feelings, systems, and pressures. In cases where a youth has a very significant mental health concerns, such as active psychosis, schizophrenia, or severe mania related to bipolar disorder, the youth court system can recommend a forensic assessment to determine whether or not the youth is criminally responsible for the alleged crime. The assessment is often completed at a forensic hospital for a minimum of 30 days. If the youth is deemed not criminally responsible for the crime, they would not have a criminal record and would complete psychiatric treatment until the forensic team feels the youth can be reintegrated back into community. The Ontario Review Board would assess the youth's situation on a yearly basis to determine whether or not the youth poses a risk to themselves, others, or the community as a whole. If the review board agrees the youth does not pose a risk, the forensic team would then assess community supports and stay involved to ensure the transition back to community is as smooth as possible. As workers, it's easy to get almost a tunnel vision and focus on the most glaring concern the youth presents for us, for example, their mental health struggles. However, we really need to work hard to learn as much about each part of the youth's reality to fully understand how each system plays a role. For example, some Indigenous communities view schizophrenia very differently than Western medicine does. As well, some Asian languages do not even have the vocabulary to describe mental health and sometimes treat psychosis as a criminal issue instead of medically. So exploring culture, gender, strengths, relationships with teachers and elders, family values, and so much more, we can really support each individual youth. And ensuring that the youth has a voice throughout the entire process, not only to maximize follow-through, but it also sets the groundwork for empowerment and personal agency within the youth. Community and family collaboration can provide wraparound support to address why the original crime was committed, provide pro-social alternatives for future scenarios, and encourage each youth to uncover their personal potential for exploring their goals and their dreams. Back over to you, Heidi.
So I'd like to share a little bit from my personal practice perspective and kind of give you some insight into working with Indigenous youth. Primarily, I work with Indigenous adults in custody right now who are incarcerated, but some of the statistics and from my experience, there is a huge number, upwards of 75 to 80% of the adults in custody, Indigenous adults in custody now, who have previous involvement in the care of child welfare as a child themselves. So I think that it's important to identify the relationship, examine the overrepresentation of these Indigenous youth. As Siu-Ming mentioned, overall youth, the number of youth entering into custody is decreasing. However, Indigenous youth, as we saw from the research, is one of the populations that has risen. We can talk a little bit about that later. But I think from a lot of your own practice perspectives, really, you know, you're all involved in some of these systems that intersect with some of these youth. And I think just examining the relationship, especially with Shane, and examining the relationship with a lot of the youth that we work with, the relationship between community, early intervention programs, family preservation services that really are involved with these youth before they even enter the criminal justice system. So not only policing and how these youth experience their interactions with the law. As Siu-Ming mentioned, a lot of these youth may even be quote unquote staying out of trouble, but their experiences of policing and being racialized is something that I think can be examined further. So the relationship between the courts, how we sentence these youth, once they do, if they do come into the correctional system, looking at working through their release. We really have the advantage of, when we work with youth, to really engage the family and the community in which they live in, which is a huge advantage than working with adults. I think the link between youth, Indigenous youth that come into custody, so from my perspective, a lot of these youth may transition from being a youth in custody as a young offender in a young offender center. Once they turn 18, the mandate to work with them within that system ends, and many of these youth, especially if they happen to be a more violent crime, may transition into adult custody. So there's a whole other layer there to examine. So working with incarcerated Indigenous and at-risk youth, as I mentioned, really important to, from your expertise, to think about early intervention and community services. One of the responses and best practices, and I think it's important also to mention that when we look at evidence-based practice, which is, you know, something that we try to, an angle that we really try to work from, it's very difficult. There are a lot of limitations when we start thinking about some of the approaches and methods, and especially the traditional healing methodologies with working some of these youth. There might not be the typical research to support or evidence to support, especially when we're only measuring recidivism. So I think there's so many things that we need to look at incorporating around integrating different interventions. So what I found in the work that I do, that engaging these youth in different interventions, if we involve an Indigenous lens or perspective, a lot of these youth are seeking that positive sense, that healthy sense of identity, especially when we looked at the case study and Shane is becoming involved in the gang lifestyle. So what the gang, these urban or street level gangs, the lure that they really provide to a lot of these Indigenous youth is a sense of status and belonging and fulfilling a role. And really one of those things that typically healthy families would give youth. So I think that not just removing the youth from the gang, but look at exit strategies. I know Rebecca also mentioned working with youth and examining a lot of the different mental health issues and loss, which is, you know, quite evident. So some of these interventions can blend Indigenous traditional and cultural approaches. We are very fortunate in a lot of our correctional institutions, our youth centers, that We have access to elders, we have access to healthy Indigenous community members that can offer involvement in ceremonies, different traditional practices that may or may not incorporate other interventions, more conventional interventions. But I think really the overarching goal is to really build a healthy cultural identity in some of these youth. I do want to mention as well, I think it's important to mention from my experience as well, that many of these youth, because they've had previous involvement in child welfare, and some of them quite extensive, some of them may not be connected to their family of origin at all, so they're disconnected, and Indigenous identity might be so far from their own personal frame of reference. So it's quite difficult engaging these youth when they do come into conflict with the law. They might be seeking out that sense of healthy identity and who am I, and how does that fit in, as an Indigenous person? Do they see themselves as an Indigenous person? So I think that's also something to consider. Not necessarily a lot of these youth will be engaged or will benefit from that. But where we do see youth, if they're seeking that, if we see an opportunity to involve them and connect them to that, I think is a place to start. I do want to add on with Shane with the case study, and what seems to work quite well is when we have opportunities to engage communities in restorative practices. So restorative, not only restorative justice, but restorative practices have links to Indigenous culture traditionally, and the use of circles and the use of elders, involving people in the family, the community, where this youth will be returning, can be a really beneficial way of working with these youth. Many of you have probably either worked in or are familiar with restorative justice principles, where it's really about not focusing on a law was broken, what are we going to do with this youth, but looking at a harm was caused and how do we restore this harm. Because these youth are returning to their homes or their communities, how do we really work and engage the family and the community to embrace them in a different way? Especially when we're not looking simply at recidivism, but really strengthening their protective factors, reducing their risk factors. So finding opportunities where you can work from a restorative model can be adopted. I think this conversation we're having today is really quite timely, especially within the current trend and the context just within our country now around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. If you're not familiar with that, I've provided some links here, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out of 6 years of research and stories from survivors and intergenerational survivors of residential school that looked at the impact on families, communities, and some of the resulting social problems. So what came out of that were some recommendations, as they call them, these calls to action. So there are 94 calls to action that really prompt us, whether at the individual level, within our community, or systemically, societally, really propels us to think about where we're involved in, how we can respond in different ways. This youth, Shane, and many of the work that we do involve not only the justice system, but health, education, child welfare. And it really gives us an opportunity to kind of broaden our lens, I guess, in looking at the work that we do with Indigenous youth, as we know that there is a huge overrepresentation of these youth coming into conflict with the law. I do want to mention one program that was evidence-based and developed out of Alberta, the Native Counseling Services of Alberta, which seems to work very well, is called Tapway Warriors. So it's a correctional-based program, although it's available in the community, but it came out of looking at engaging some of these youth and training some of them. So some of the youth that come into conflict with the law, some of these youth that are at risk, involving them so they provide that peer support to other youth at risk. And that's one of the evidence bases that a lot of us, that work in these systems, it's difficult to engage youth sometimes, and they tend to, especially youth that are involved in the gangs, they're seeking that approval and that recognition from their peers. So if we replace that with healthy peer involvement, such as the Stepway Warriors program, it really gets youth to be involved at that level, supporting other youth. One other mention is what really guides our practice in working with Indigenous youth, again, the TRC. You can look into that, but the UNDRIC, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is, we've ratified that in Canada, and it really provides us a framework to guide some of these approaches. So it's not necessarily a specific way of doing things, but it also acknowledges that Indigenous youth have unique needs and rights around language and education and culture, and it helps us just understand, just across the board, the importance of recognizing that link. I do want to mention, and I guess this conversation, I hope what comes out of it is get us all to think about, where we can, I guess, kind of step up in thinking about there is a link between youth and care. When we focus on the criminalization of youth in care of child welfare, that's something that's really important to think about. We do criminalize youth that are in care of child welfare. A lot of these youth are, if they end up being sent to secure treatment settings, group homes, so we unfortunately end up early on criminalizing some of these youth for some of those very behaviors. So I think we start thinking about how we can work with these youth before they come into conflict with the law. I think that's where where one of the areas we can start. There's some additional resources here, as I mentioned, around the TRC, some of the final report and findings. Incidentally, one of the calls to action is what we're doing today is really educating ourselves around how we can respond in different ways. That's one of the calls to action itself. So I'm going to pass it back over to Siu-Ming.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Heidi. All right, I'm going to talk about what we have found from a literature review, and then we cover about what's working, not working, also about our recommendation. And there are several points I want to mention here. The first one is we clearly, from the literature and from the research, we see that there's overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in our system, especially in the custody. The second point is about there's a limited literature regarding about the promising practice for Indigenous youth and also about racialized youth. We don't have that kind of data actually, so that is, we are quite not in a good position to help them. We have to work more on that actually. And one thing, the next one is what is not working is we cannot just put them in the system, in the court system, especially for those who are the first time and with minor offense. We cannot do that because according to the literature and the research, it's not working actually. It's not working. And the next one is about what actually is working for them. It's the principles, okay, we find from the literature. The first one is, as we mentioned earlier, because youth have different level of criminal involvement. So all the programs should target about the different level of criminal involvement. There's no one generic cookie cutter approach, so that you have to tailor-make according to their different level of risk involvement. The second one is about diversion program. According to literature, it's working actually because, and also it is many theoretical approach that inform about the practice. The program, we divert the youth our system, and then we try to get rid of the label for them. Once they get labeled, they are more involved in the system. So that the diversion program from the literature are working. When we mention diversion program, there's a whole variety of the diversion program. And we can say that in general, they are working. The next one is about targeted intervention form. The literature indicate that we cannot just work with individual, the youth. We have to work with other systems, school system, and also other, like even the criminal justice system, together, the community as well, together to work with not only the youth, but with the family together. And as far as possible, you also need to work with the community together, because our focus is not just on individual, because there are so many factors beyond the control of the youth, actually. So you have to target that all together. The next one is the treatment length. It's interesting with this one here is many of the programs they find it successful is that treatment linkage is around 6 months. Okay, you cannot less than 6 months or you cannot beyond 6 months, because 6 months seems the optimum period, so that we have to utilize that kind of period for the 6 months to help the youth and the family. The next one, treatment setting. There's one debate about whether treatment in custody working or outside or in the community are working. The conclusion is quite inconclusive, actually. We don't know much, actually, because sometimes they're working, sometimes they're not working. So we go down to the nature of the treatment program. Are they fit into the context, the local context? Are they fit to the level or the risk level of the youth? Okay, so that the emphasis is more on the nature of the program instead of the setting. The last one is program integrity. The literature indicates that all the programs, when they find that they require promising practice or successful, is they have a clear objective. They have a philosophy or theoretical framework behind the program. So they have a clear objective. They know how to implement that. They have a good staff supervision. And even the youth, they are also aware about the objective of the program. So there's a clear, everything is so clear to everyone. And also about the manual, how to implement the program, because to protect the integrity of the program. Or most of the program, they have their own manual about how to implement the program step by step. And this kind of manual, not only is not written by the staff member, it's also engage the youth or even the family to write it together, so that they have the ownership about the manual. And once they have the manual and every stakeholder, okay, they know how to implement the program, it's very coordination of different parties with this kind of manual. And also at last, all this kind of successful program, they have built-in evaluation. When we say evaluation, it's not only like a standardized measurement scale, it's also about how give them a assessment about how to get improvement for the program and for themselves as well. So that program evaluation is also the key for the successful program implementation. The last one about recommendation. We have 9 recommendations here. The first one is about we need to have a clear guideline for all the diversion program. One of the limitations for the new legislation for the 2003 for the Youth Criminal Justice Act is about the discretions given to the frontline worker for law enforcement. Because nowadays it heavily depends on the police and the prosecutor to exercise the right, okay, their discretions to whether to divert the youth or not divert the youth. And there's a huge discrepancy, a huge deviation from one jurisdiction to other jurisdiction, and even from one province to other province. And that we suggest we need to have a more clear protocol about, like in the spirit of the new legislation, we need to divert, especially for those who are from indigenous community outside the court system. Now it's so fussy before because it seems like it depends on their individual judgment sometimes or their professional judgment, but we want more clear guidelines because, as I said before, that now the implementation something deviation from the spirit of the new legislation, especially for the indigenous youth, so that we need more clear guidelines. Second one, we don't have data on the racialized group, the youth racialized group. We don't have data for the analysis. As long as we don't have data, we don't know how to provide the best practice for this population. So we suggest we need that kind of race-based data in the criminal justice system. Allow us to help the youth and work together with them and the family. The next one is about coordination about all diversion programs within your district or city. Why we say that? Because from our research and also the literature finding, we find there are many, many good programs in the community, but they are operated isolated. And even we some of the system, they want to divert the youth to the community. There's no central list actually, so that it's always quite difficult for the worker to divert people out actually in the community. So that we want to have a more coordination among different services. Even we can create a kind of a list, central listing, so that all the people know about what's going on in the community and then what kind of program you can make referral to. Number 4, data sharing strategy. Now the diversion programs, when you get in and when you get out, because now the measurement or the success of the program in Canada and many in Ontario is about the offending rate. And because in a diversion program, sometimes you don't keep that rate. Okay, and then is it because in the police have the full jurisdiction about this kind of data. So it's quite difficult sometimes for us, for the program in the community, to measure in terms of the reoffending rate. So that we have to ask the police to have some kind of access to their data in order to establish one of our criteria for measure the success of the program. The next one is family-oriented approach, and even more than that, we also engage the whole community to the practice. We are no longer working on the individual. We work with the whole system, the whole family, and the community. The next one is about, it's not top-down approach, because many youth, while they detach from the society because they don't have a sense of ownership of a community. We don't want to repeat that kind of experience to the youth. So that all programs should engage the youth and give them a sense of ownership of the program. This is a program we work together. It's not only imposed on you. Work together with you and also with the family. The next one is about the respect to the cultural background of the youth. Many youth, why they come to the program, because they have that kind of connection with the staff member. And also, when they say, and we mentioned that in the literature, all the programs, successful programs, they have the clear objective. But when in practice, the youth actually have the connection not only to the program, to the staff member actually. So that we have to create atmosphere about, or we train the staff about they have the level of competency to connect with the youth, especially about their cultural background. This is one of the key findings we have for the youth from racialized group, because they want to connect with the program, which the staff understand their cultural background. Also about develop program management, as we know that it is one key element about how to give the ownership to the youth, give back to the youth, is we develop a program manual, so that is a kind of ownership, okay, they have for the youth. And we develop together with the youth so that they can know the expectation on them, okay. The last one is, again, we need to have an evaluation framework for all the youth program. Okay, now, do you have any questions? And actually, we have some questions sent to us in advance. So we're going to address some of the questions in here. And I will say that all the questions you sent to us, we are going to address that one by one. Okay, don't worry about that. And also after the webinar, you have some more questions, you can also send to us. And also we're going to address that in the follow-up. Okay, after the webinar.
Thanks, Siu-Ming and Heidi and Rebecca. It's Rebecca from YouthREX here. We're a little bit behind time. We only have 4 minutes left in the webinar. So I'm just going to ask participants if you're able to stay for an additional 10 minutes of questions. We'd appreciate that. And just second what Siu-Ming said, if you have any questions that come to you after this webinar, please email and we will respond to you. We had questions coming in advance, and we had several questions cluster around the question of reintegration and concerns around continuums of care upon release and filling the gaps that young people may get released from custody back into the same environment that sort of supported their problems in the first place. So we are asking Siu-Ming and Heidi if you could respond to the question of follow-up care and continuum of care.
Yes, I speak first, so Heidi can add on the information. It's quite difficult, especially we cannot change the environment, so that when the youth go back to the community in the aftercare service, so that they go back to the same environment. So that our principle is we need to set up a plan for the youth before they go back to the community. And even we can ask the community worker to come in to have that kind of connection with the youth first and set the plan not only for the youth, but for the family and even for the community, so that we have to work together. One of the other things is about a coordination of services in the community. Now that it's so isolated, so that we also suggest about there's certain kind of network or coordination among all agencies in the community, so that they know each other, so that if they want help, they can put all the resources to help the case before they reintegrate back to society. Heidi.
Thank you, Siu-Ming. I know there are some practice models, some programs that seem to work quite well here in Alberta. I'm curious if there are similar programs in Ontario. In BC and Saskatchewan, there are also a lot of First Nations reintegration programs. They offer family justice initiatives. We have the advantage when we do work with youth, as was mentioned earlier, to really engage the family while that youth is still in custody, and then further from that to engage the community and really to invite people that are involved with this youth in supporting them and living in a healthier way. I think some of these projects, I think we also get caught up kind of working in isolation. So as Siu-Ming mentioned, the coordination of those services, and even from your perspective, those of you, the viewers, to think about some of these interagency or reintegration projects and how you can coordinate some of these services. And just to echo what Siu-Ming had mentioned, to begin working with some of these youth when we come into contact with them, working with them quickly rather than upon release.
Okay, thanks, Heidi. Sorry. I have a question. I'd like to bring back Rebecca. Rebecca, we have questions for you around mental health supports. I wonder, there's a specific question that came in around dual diagnosis. Young people who have autism spectrum disorder and mental health diagnosis. And then this person is wondering, are you aware of any opportunities for young people who aren't eligible for a forensic assessment and who have aged out of traditional treatments for ASDs? So that's a very specific question. And then could you answer that question, and then more broadly about responding to mental health issues that young people experience?
Okay, so I think it really depends on the community you come from and what kind of supports are available there. I can only really speak to London, Ontario, where I'm at. I know aging out is difficult from the youth system, especially with the ministry itself having a lot more funding and supports for youth involved in the criminal justice system. I know in London we have different programs through the hospital that are connected with youth and adult probation officers, such as the Prevention of Early Psychosis program, the PEP program, as well as concurrent disorders, and Thames Valley Children's Center for Autism Spectrum Disorders, and different supports like that. Especially if they're not as severe, for lack of a better word, in terms of mental health, to go for the forensic assessment. Different communities do have therapeutic court systems. So in London, we have both an adult and youth therapeutic court, which really take into consideration mental health difficulties when considering sentencing for criminal charges, as well as having different supports available to attend court proceedings, to really connect both youth and adults with community supports that are available in the community. I've heard smaller cities in the area, St. Thomas and Woodstock, kind of around my area here, are also implementing therapeutic courts, which is kind of nice to see that they're really considering the mental health aspect of it and how significant that is for a criminal offense. So I'm sorry it's not really a specific answer. I think it really kind of depends on the community and what's available, which makes it a lot more difficult for more northern communities or more isolated communities.
Thanks, Rebecca. Following up on that, I'd like to turn it back to Heidi, and this is a question related to access to supports for First Nations. One person is asking, specific to an Ontario context, I don't know if there's a corollary in Ontario or not, but how much support can First Nations young people receive in their communities when court does not happen as often in northern areas? So it's kind of about, I think it's a question about responsivity and the way that the system is structured. So that's one question. And another person asked a similar question about a program that is available. They mention it. Nishnawbe Aski Legal Services has some great programs, but there are some barriers, I guess, to it being adopted. They have new programs. So one person is asking where programs do exist and there's no trust in them. How can we make the programs accountable? And then, yeah, so it's kind of a question around, I think, the system's ability to respond to the unique needs of Indigenous communities.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think there's so many angles to kind of approach that question. I think one I'm kind of hearing is that's one of the challenges we still face, especially working with Indigenous populations, First Nations communities, is the issue around funding and some of the systems and programs where some of these services exist and accessibility. As we start getting more in isolated communities, of course, less isolation, and I think the question was mentioned, sometimes there is no court, policing, there's so many different community needs that aren't being met. That's one of the limitations. I think there are a lot of really good models, and some going back decades. One is the Hollow Water case example in Ontario, where a community really started taking ownership around their own healing and their own restorative practices. And rather than having kind of these fly-in or drop-in services, is really getting community members to be trained to have their own sentencing circles, to feel supported with other agencies, whether it's courts or whether it's family services, which really, I guess, identifies the need for self-determination in some of these things. Siu-Ming mentioned that too, is allowing the families, not only these youth, but their families and the communities in which they live, especially if it's an Indigenous community, to feel ownership over some of these programs. I think the second part of that question, is just really quickly, I'll answer, is how can we, I guess, develop trust in some of these programs and keep them, the integrity of them. And I think that really goes back to that community involvement and staying connected to other agencies that might already be doing similar work. Again, branching out, thinking, establishing some of these new roadways and involving other stakeholders where we can. There's so many opportunities to do some of this restorative work in these areas.
Thanks so much, Heidi. This will be our last question. I apologize to anyone who we didn't ask your question. We're over time, but we will respond to you. This is a question about the role of employment programs in prevention and reintegration. So I'm wondering if, Siu-Ming, you happen to know, or if, and I'm not really sure who to direct this question to, but in terms of skill building within custody or skill building prior to custody, what's the role of employment, and can employment services support young people involved with the law?
Yeah, this is a good question, because indeed, indeed, it is a good practice, and this is supported by the research as well. And there's a correlation between the gainful employment and about reducing the rate of reoffending. So we have been supported by the research. As long as they have a skill training and then go to get, we call it gainful employment, so that they can support themselves, so that create a kind of connection back to the society and also empower them to that kind of capacity. They have a contributing member, become a contributing member to the society again. That is the key, yes, and we need to build that kind of like employment training program for the youth before they go back to the society, or for the youth at risk as well.
Great. Well, that brings us to the end. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the presenters for sharing your insights and for opening this conversation with our community, our youth sector community in Ontario, and to raising awareness about some of the issues. I want to thank the participants who joined us this morning in the conversation, and I'd like to invite you all to a follow-up webinar that we'll be hosting at the end of April, which will focus on research from Ryerson University about a project called Crossover Youth, and that's about youth who move from child welfare system into the criminal justice system. And then we'll also be featuring a community-based youth program that runs diversion and reintegration programming, so we'll get a community-based perspective as well. I'd like to invite you to read the report that we've produced. It's under the handouts that we've included. It'll be on our website as well. And then the recording of this webinar will compile all the questions that we've received with answers. So we'll get those back to you as well. If you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. And again, I'd like to extend my thanks to everyone involved and wish you all a wonderful day. And I'll say thank you again and hope to see you all again soon. Thanks so much, everyone.